Okay, now we'll talk about the three types of operations that you can perform with the laser. One is a vector cut, the other one is a vector mark, and the third one is a raster engrave. Okay, vector cut and vector mark are very similar. The only difference is that with vector cut, you cut all the way through. Vector mark, you're cutting, but you're not cutting all the way through. So you're just leaving a mark on the surface. And then raster engrave is where you'll actually be engraving a picture or an image. Here's an example of what each will look like. So here we see an example of raster engraving. The laser moves back and forth really fast and it just engraves the image onto the material. And then we see an example of vector cutting. In this case, the laser actually moves following a vector line, and it's going to fire a consistent beam of laser that will actually cut through the part. So here's a project where they're cutting through various materials to make these fun custom glass frames. All right, let's talk about vector cutting. When you're vector cutting, the laser follows a continuous path of an outline, and it's used to completely cut through a material. In order to cut a vector pattern, you need to work with a vector file, and these include files with extensions such as PDFs, SVGs, DXF, DWGs, or AI. So your Illustrator file, or if you're using AutoCAD, you can export as a PDF, for example, or really any vector editing software that allows you to export with any one of these vector extensions will allow you to cut a pattern in the laser cutter. Now with our laser, the way you tell it that you want to cut a specific line is that you set that line width to 0.001 inch. And this is something we'll go over when we do the in-person training. All right, next we're going to talk about vector marking. And vector marking is essentially the same thing as vector cutting. The only distinction here is that the laser is not going to cut all the way through. And this is basically accomplished by either lowering the power or increasing the speed of the laser. So in this picture, for example, if you wanted a model to have a texture of brick on the walls here, you would use vector marking. It would trace the outline of the bricks, but it's not going to cut all the way through. You would apply the same principle with the shingles. Okay, now let's talk about raster engraving. And raster engraving differs from vector cutting because the laser is not following a continuous line here to make a cut. With raster engraving, the laser scans back and forth a series of dots and lines at a time. And this is used with scanned images, so like text, clip art, photographs. And these images will be defined by pixels and not vectors. So you're mainly dealing with file extensions that are either JPEGs or PNGs. For example, if you take a picture with your phone and you want to engrave it, you can bring it in as a JPEG and engrave that image. Or if you want to grab an image off the internet, you can simply Google the image, bring it in, and you'll be able to use raster engraving to engrave the image. Okay, so let's just go over some basic vector cutting examples. In this case, if you were looking to cut out this shape, you would simply set your laser to cut everywhere it sees this line. So these are vector lines, and it would follow this image to cut out this shape. Now, if we were to vector mark this, so here in this image, instead of these cutting all the way through, all we're doing is marking it. So we still see these lines and they're not cutting all the way through, but we are cutting the outside in order to have this shape. So we would set the outside line to be a vector cut, and in all the blue would be a vector mark. And then in this last image here, all the black shaded in area would be a raster engrave. So we would still cut the outside as a vector cut, but the black would be all raster engraved. And this is the shape we would get here. Completely cut, but wherever it sees shading, it would just give us a raster engrave. Okay, so as I said before, in order to use the laser cutter to cut shapes, we'll need a software that's capable of creating vector lines. In the makerspace, we have Adobe Illustrator, but you can use a number of different software, including CorelDRAW Inkscape, which is a free version of Illustrator, AutoCAD, Fusion 360, or any type of CAD software. Now remember, pixel-based drawings such as JPEG and PNGs, these will not cut, but they can be engraved. So you don't necessarily need a vector software in order to be able to just engrave something in the laser. So here's the important distinction you want to leave with. Pixel-based drawings such as JPEGs and PNGs, these can be engraved, but they cannot be cut. Vectors can either be cut or engraved.